Hello, everyone. What I wanted to do in this video is to simply review some of the things that were said on the discussion boards during the first 3 weeks of the class as you prepare to write your first essay on this material, which we'll just call Unit 1. The readings from Epicurus through Nagel to Bruckner and Fisher's Why is Death Bad? I just thought it'd be good, just to respond to some things that were said on the discussion board. For just to do it in general is a good idea, I think, but for clarification of some issues and some interesting ideas were put out there, and just generally speaking, commentary on the first 3 weeks of the discussion board. Hopefully, this will be of some help as you get your thoughts together for your first paper. Of course, we started this class with Epicurus, his letter to Menoikos. There's a comment here. Again, these are all comments that people have put up. I feel comfortable since they're put up in public. They are anonymous. I just thought it'd be simpler if I didn't attach names to them. But these are just things that I thought either were particularly interesting or raised important issues or provided an opportunity for clarification. Epicurus states, quote, "Death, therefore, the most awful of evils, is nothing to us, seeing that when we are, death is not come, and when death is come, we are not." This means that there is never, this is the person's commentary now, this means that there is never an overlap between a human and death. The person who is dying technically never experienced death. I think that is correct. We should remind ourselves always, we should always try to be textually accurate. That is, we should always try to be very careful about what is precisely what is said in any particular text. I think that this is a perfectly accurate interpretation. That is, that there's no overlap between us and death, that we never actually experience death. I'm sure that's something I must have said in the videos, and I stand behind it. I just want to point out that in my reading it recently, that the word experience never occurs in Epicurus. I think that it is an immediate and valid inference that we can make on the basis of what Epicurus does say. But just to be a little careful, that when, that sometimes we're quoting, sometimes we're paraphrasing, sometimes we're extrapolating, and those things can really blend into one another. But I think it is an incredibly important point, because I do believe that it is an immediate and valid inference that we make from the quote here, which is a very important quote, that death is not a possible human experience. If we make this distinction between dying and death very strictly, if we say that, along with Epicurus, that death is merely the privation, the taking away, or even, to use another word that he doesn't use, limit of life and experience, that it cannot itself be a part of that life and experience. I think it is an important inference to draw from what he says. I think it is valid, but there are a few qualifications. But it's an incredibly important point, I think, at least for how I think of the philosophy of death, and that under Epicurean conditions, death is really not a possible experience of life. Another remark about Epicurus: the logical explanation that Epicurus puts forth in this letter of what death means for us as humans makes it completely reasonable to not worry about death while alive. This is so because once we die, we're not able to experience anymore. Therefore, death is not bad nor good for us. It's just the end. I would fully endorse this interpretation. I mean, it reflects my own ideas about what Epicurus was up to. It certainly reflects, I hope, the kind of things I was saying in the videos, because I would entirely agree with it. And there's some really important ideas here. Because death is the end of all experience, and because death is simply the end of all feeling, thought, sensation, that leads Epicurus to conclude that it is not something we should be worried about, because it can have no value for us. Because if death is the limit of our existence, then one could characterize death itself as non-existence, and non-existence can be neither good nor bad. So if it's true that we should only worry about things that we have legitimate reasons for believing will be bad, then there's no reason to worry about death. Now, I think that's a fine argument on the part of the Epicurean. I don't know if it holds up entirely to scrutiny. In a certain sense, much of what we do now is challenging that. Obviously, Nagel challenges it. Bruckner and Fisher challenge it, and later philosophers, to one extent or another, directly or indirectly, will challenge it. And by it, I mean the claim that death cannot be conceived of as something bad, and therefore it's not something we should worry about. But I would definitely agree with what's said here. This is an interesting idea, maybe a little bit, a little bit of going off in a certain direction, but that's good. The student said here, there is constant evidence that the imprint we leave behind once we pass has the potential to echo on centuries beyond our physical deaths. Our actions can potentially impact life immortally for both the present populations and those who will live thousands of years beyond our death. Need an example? How old is Epicurus' letter to Menoicus? That's a great point, isn't it? And yet we're still reading it and being influenced by it. Today, talk about immortal. A really wonderful point. Thus, our death does not mark the death of our influence. The ripples of our lives travel indefinitely. That's a really great remark. A really interesting idea. I should say that, if I'm not mistaken, depending on how I schedule the readings, the last thing we read, Walter Schultz's The Problem of Death, will talk about this, and certainly Hans Jonas's ideas of the second Jonas essay that we'll read, Immortality in the Modern Temper, and also Hartshorne's Time, Death, and Eternal Life, do have to do with this so-called imprint idea. Both Hartshorne and Jonas talk about the book of life, what's left behind, what we leave behind. And certainly the student makes a very good point, ironically, that, letter to Menoicus is something left behind from thousands of years ago that's still influencing us. So certainly Epicurus, the philosopher, has left an imprint. But two things I think an Epicurean would say. One thing I think Epicurean would definitely say is that, yes, you may leave an imprint on the world, but you're not, an obvious thing to say, and I'm not saying that this person doesn't realize it, but you're not there to appreciate that imprint. Right? I mean, you may leave something behind, some trace of you that continues to influence people, but you will not be privy to that, right? You're not there to appreciate or to feel happy about your influence, or sad, so there's that, which I guess is the immediate Epicurean point that might be made. And secondly, this notion of leaving things behind and, having an immortal or an eternal influence. Well, think about immortality. It's a very long time. It's like forever, right? So, sure, Epicurus continues to influence us with his thought. How long later? 2,500 years later or so. But let's give it another few thousand years. That is, as far as like continuing to influence human history into the future, I guess it really depends upon. It is quite impressive that we're still reading this, basically the scrap of paper that Epicurus scribbled some notes on thousands of years ago. But what is the proper time frame? 2,500 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years? That's an very interesting observation, but a couple of ideas there. The student said it may not make sense to desire immortality if immortality is not saving us from anything negative in the first place. That's something I really tried to emphasize in the videos. That really was a strong point that Epicurus was making. That his line about not yearning after immortality, because we know there are no terrors in ceasing to live. If basically if our yearning for immortality is motivated by an avoidance of death, then that, from Epicurus' point of view, is irrational, because death is not something to be avoided, because it's not a bad thing. It can't harm us in any way. So it's a strong point. I'm glad the student emphasized it. I think it's a strong point in Epicurus. I feel like so many people, including myself, always express that they want to live a long life or live forever, and then that's something maybe we can talk about. I mean, we have people have very different ideas on whether they like to live forever. But we'll get to that. But then I wonder why I had this desire. I mean, that's a great remark. I think it brings up, on the one hand, what Epicurus says seems perfectly reasonable. On the other hand, we don't normally think that way. Why do we fear death if death is not to be feared? Why do some of us yearn after immortality if there's nothing to fear in death? Human psychology does seem to resist a lot of what Epicurus says, and that's certainly Nagel and Bruckner and Fisher believe that they are kind of providing a rational justification of human psychology when they defend the idea that death is, in fact, a bad thing. This was an interesting idea, I thought, kind of off the beaten path. What would he say, I suppose this is Epicurus, about death and how it relates to sleep? Depending on the level of sleep, a person goes through many levels of non-awareness. And what of sedation? In his time alive, anesthesiology would have been non-existent to Epicurus. It's certainly true. Oh, they did have drugs. They had drugs back then. Sleep-inducing drugs, maybe even coma-inducing drugs. I don't know. And yet, being sedated would render anyone utterly unaware. Would either of these states, either asleep or sedated, be considered a type of death, either temporary or otherwise, by Epicurus? A great question. If death is the taking away of all consciousness, well, there are periods during life where we have that taken away. If you've ever been knocked unconscious, like blow to the head, I have as a child, a couple times actually, playing sports, doing other things we won't talk about. It's a period of nothingness, like the period during which we are under sodium pentothal, whatever the drug is, that is a full anesthesia and we're having surgery. It's a complete blank, or an experiential blank, as Bruckner and Fisher call it. Does this qualify as death? Does he believe us to be in a state of non-existence during these instances? That's an interesting question. It would be a very strange thing if we went so far as to say that during those periods of utter lack of consciousness that we did not exist, because that would sort of, how did we pop back in existence? Right? What would his thoughts be about someone who died on the surgical table? These are really great questions, great philosophical questions. In my own thinking about death, perhaps the only thing that I think does differentiate, let's say, being totally unconscious, no dreaming, no internal experience of any sort, from being dead, is that being dead is permanent. That you have to add that it's the permanent cessation of consciousness. Now, I don't know if that's cheating or something, but that's certainly, I think, a plausible thing that differentiates temporary periods of complete unconsciousness from death. So that death is permanent and irrevocable. Let's see, somebody said, I agree with Epicurus that death is nothing to us. It is a waste of time thinking about dying, because not only is death inevitable, once we reach death, there is nothing of our being or existence anymore. We are born into this life with an understanding that the only way for us to exit is by death. So why allow the thought of death to cloud your memory when you still have life to live? That's a very Epicurean thought, I think. And it's an important part of the letter to Menoicus. Epicureanism in general as a way of life is a kind of a hedonism. And hedonism is just the philosophy, the moral philosophy, or the philosophy of life that enjoyment, pleasure, and happiness are the things that we want in life. They're basically the main goal. Avoidance of pain, suffering, and unhappiness going along with that. And so if there is something, if there's an avoidable pain, the pain of, say, having anxiety about death, then we should avoid it. And if realizing that death is not something to be feared helps us to alleviate that anxiety, we should go ahead and be rational. I think the only qualification I would about this remarks here is that I don't think that Epicurus ever says that we should not worry about death because it's inevitable. It's maybe another philosophy. It might be Stoicism, actually, but that is his main point, and I think the student reflects this here. I'm not saying this is wrong, but Epicurus' main point is that we should not fear death because it truly is nothing. Whereas it's a distinct argument to say we shouldn't fear death because it's inevitable and there's nothing we can do about it. So, but I thought this was a valuable remark. I do not think I agree with Epicurus that once a person dies, it is the end. However, I can see his opinion if it were true. I think I would be more scared to know that once I die, I cease to exist. I would like to know that once I die, there is something greater that we can understand instead of my life completely ending and being totally annihilated. Well, these are very interesting, good, valuable thoughts. These are kind of, frankly, the kind of typical responses to reading Epicurus. They're certainly the responses that I had when I first read him, and many, many, many of my students over the years have responded the same way. These are good thoughts. These are relevant thoughts. These are the big questions that reading anything on death, anything that's good, will elicit in us. A resistance to the idea that death is the absolute end. Sure, we will pick that thread up later in the semester. The idea there's something in us balks, some of us at least. Another thread that's here that will be picked up later is the idea that we'll say that death is non-existence. Should not be afraid. Isn't non-existence in itself something dreadful to think about? That certainly is the existential view, I think, that there is something absolutely dreadful about death just because it means non-existence, which is interesting because Epicurus says, since death is non-existence, there's nothing to fear. But it would seem that there is an alternative position that might say, and I think it's suggested here in the student's work, that death is more fearful, more frightening, because it means non-existence. So it's an interesting, there's interesting alternative responses to the notion that death is mere non-existence. Okay, so that's Epicurus. I'm going to do another video on Nagel. I'm trying to do Nagel and Bruckner and Fisher at the same time.